So I'm here with Rohan, Phadte, and Bhat. They're the co-founders of Robot Labs, which is, I was just telling them, a really charming portmanteau of their names, which I like. And I think we're going to talk a lot about sort of what bots mean for our lives and for our consumption of information. And I think we should probably start by talking about what we're talking about when we say a bot. What is a bot?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, definitely. So when we talk about bots, we're talking about automated accounts, be it on Twitter, be it on Facebook, that are tweeting out information in an automated fashion. So we're talking about accounts that may look human, but seem to be tweeting out every minute, every 5 minutes. But the core concept here is that they're automated.
So to add a little bit to that, basically, if you go on a platform like Twitter or Facebook, you may encounter posts that look like any other post that you see, that your friends write, that a journalist might write, but that is in fact not written by a human, but is set up a script or a program to just continuously push certain messages or retweet even. Is that bots can retweet things, right?
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. So I want to start then by talking a little bit about a tool that you guys built called botcheck.me. So maybe you can tell the crowd sort of what that is and what the impetus for it was.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so botcheck.me is an extension that Ash and I have built. And it's basically our solution to fighting back against this Twitter propaganda bot problem. And so one of the biggest things we saw on Twitter was a lot of these accounts tried really, really hard to be human. Like they advertise themselves as American citizens. But they often tweeted out very political, polarizing content, usually often led to mislead. And we were diving into these kinds of profiles and realized these aren't human, these aren't actual real human beings and their opinions. This is just like amplified voices here. And so we built botcheck.me, and it is a Chrome extension that you can install on your browser. So as you're browsing the web on Twitter, you can actually identify what accounts are bots and what accounts are actually humans.
And the worry around bots is that what we've seen and what terrifies us is that these bots can effectively divide a nation. One of the examples of this was right after the Parkland shootings, we noticed bot networks actually propagate hashtags like hashtag gun control now, as opposed to hashtags like hashtag mental illness. And what this caused was a nation at a point where we should have been together actually get very divided over a very divisive issue.
And I think there's also a good point there that when bots are tweeting out information with hashtags, it's a way of both organizing a lot of these tweets together in a way where you're not certain that it's an automated program versus a human, and that can distort the public's sense of sort of what the actual conversation around something is. So if you're seeing thousands of tweets all with the hashtag, whatever it is, stop gun control or
hashtag gun control now.
Yeah. Right, and then it sort of leads to this sense of, oh, this is where people are impassioned, this is the conversation happening, when in fact it's not even people doing it.
Exactly.
And there are real political implications for this, right? I mean, I think certainly we know that at least one politician pays a lot of attention to Twitter. So I think the implications are beyond just sort of our own ability to be informed.
Definitely. Yeah.
I wanted to sort of contextualize this a bit further for people, just to sort of give a scope of the problem. So this is according to a Pew study that 2/3 of the tweets with links to websites, so 2/3 of the tweets that are out there that then link back to a popular website are actually by bots or automated. And I'm wondering how many of those, I don't know if you'll know the answer to this, but how many of those are political propaganda versus like there are good bots or at least sort of neutral, harmless bots too, right?
Yeah, definitely. In order to add on to that, yeah, Twitter actually is a platform that allows bots on their social platform. And for the most part, these bots are relatively harmless. We've seen instances where bots are tweeting out the next radio song on a station, or we're seeing bots where they're tweeting out the next traffic jams on a big highway intersection. And those are informative bots. There are some bots, though, that are, again, the ones that we try to find and the ones we think are the most harmful are the ones that have tried really hard to be human, try to push a different narrative or spread fake news, and then try to make a political discourse on the social media platform itself.
And the worry for us today is that our generation, Gen Z, actually consumes more news on social media than on traditional media. And so when you have bots propagating misinformation, that's what the youth of today are consuming. And that's our generation, and thus we felt so impassioned to build something for it.
you should tell your friends to go to theatlantic.com. We have lots of good stories there. But yeah, so I wanted to ask, what are a bot's tells? So like we know that a bot, like a Twitter account that's actually a bot, may have a profile with a human face. It may have a sort of pithy bio that says like, coffee lover, mom, American. So how, if you're just a person looking at Twitter, how can you look at, in addition to using your tool, of course, but like what are the things that you found that sort of suggest like, oh, there's something not quite human going on here?
So if you look at an account and if you notice that the recent join date is probably maybe a few months ago, and then you realize that the number of followers or retweeters they have is in the couple thousands, maybe 10,000s, a couple hundred thousands, it's a pretty good sure tell sign that that account is probably like propelled by automated accounts. We've seen instances where we would have an account that springs up and basically another entire network of bots retweet out that one username, basically getting other people to follow that account and basically bootstrap these accounts to bigger and bigger and bigger users.
To touch up on Rohan's point, it's not necessarily the obvious bots that are, it's not just the fact that you'll see content that is coming from a bot. It's also the fact that these bots actually amplify the voices of people that would not necessarily get the reach otherwise. So for example, if, let's go back to that gun control now example. Like the people who were the most extreme in those instances are the ones that got their voices amplified. And in public discourse, that is something that can be incredibly terrifying.
And from my understanding is that this is happening on both sides of the ideological spectrum, right? So
Right.
you have really extreme sort of propaganda on the left and on the right that these bot networks are amplifying and pushing out sort of in equal measure. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct, yeah.
And another thing from the same Pew study was that 500 of the most active bots are behind almost a quarter of tweets to popular news sites. I think this speaks to the same sort of dynamic that you're describing, that it's not just that there's this sprawling sort of bot army, but also that this collection of just 500 bots is responsible for a huge proportion of the overall bot traffic.
Yeah, and the thing that's incredibly terrifying about that is that like, and this entire issue, there's so many different points that we've come across, and just take a step back and we're just like, oh my God, the implications of this are pretty scary. But in terms of bots automatically responding to all these major figures and major media organizations, when you're a media organization or a big public figure and you look at your Twitter account, essentially the voices that you hear tend to be these amplified bots. So let's say you are a brand ambassador for a certain product, or you're a public politician. When you look and you try to understand how your constituents are seeing how you are a politician, you end up listening to the bots, or you end up listening to amplified content, which can be incredibly harmful.
So it's really a direct pipeline for people creating propaganda right to the nation's lawmakers.
Exactly.
That is terrifying. Is that the scariest thing to you about this? Or like what to you is the sort of biggest threat of these sorts of networks?
Yeah, I mean, there's some other scary things that we've actually looked at. Yeah, I don't really mean just to keep scaring
We'll
you
get to
guys,
hopeful
but we'll get to
things
hopeful
next, yeah.
solutions about this. But when we were doing our analysis on these Twitter bots, we've actually found out that some of these accounts that were that were these political propaganda accounts, if you looked back in their history and you looked about 4 or 5 years ago, you would see that they actually were tweeting, like, again, they weren't tweeting out every minute. They were actually tweeting about their families, or tweeting about Christmas, or tweeting about their dog. And then after about some time, you'd see like about a 6 or 8 month hiatus where they stopped tweeting, like they vanished off the face of the earth. And then suddenly they started picking up all this political rhetoric, all this like hate speech, and they started tweeting out every few minutes or so. And I guess that goes to show that these accounts were originally real humans on the network. And what ended up happening is that at some point there was like an attack, their account was compromised, and then now that account got sold in the dark web. Someone else got hands on that account and then repurposed it for these political propaganda bots. And this is how a network is created, and this is how you can sometimes find a political propaganda account in your own network, because this is the same person you followed back in high school, or maybe this is a person you found in college, or you thought this was the cool guy you met at the bar, and now suddenly they're tweeting out political propaganda.
What's really interesting about this is that we actually went out and tried to figure out how easy it would be to like actually purchase accounts on the black market and like actually automate them. And so we went out, we Googled buy Twitter account, and we went to like the second or third link, and we talked to this guy, I think his name was Ken, and we're like, hey, we'd like to buy 10 Twitter accounts. We got 10 Twitter accounts in the span of 2 hours. and these accounts came with their usernames, their passwords. We were able to automate them in the span of the next couple hours, and they're still alive. They're still tweeting out today.
What are they tweeting about?
So we've just had them tweet out different news sources. So like one tweets out Fox News every 10 minutes. The other one tweets out like the New York Times. Another one that tweets out the Washington Post. We didn't want to spread misinformation or add to the problem, but we wanted to test out. And we use that as a benchmark to see like how well Twitter is actually treating the problem.
And what's
How much
even
did they charge you
So
for an account?
this is also incredibly scary. It was $3.50 per account.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so you can build a huge social network with
And then
not
after
that
you
much.
bought them, they stopped tweeting, or
What was that?
after you bought them, then they lost control and you got control?
So what we hypothesize happened with these accounts is that these are accounts that were dormant and then got their passwords leaked and then sold on the black market. And so these are essentially accounts. One example was this account of this. She seemed to be this teenage girl who had like a whole history of chatting with her friends, but she'd stopped tweeting in 2014, and we got her account in 2017. And essentially, like we were able to automate this account and start tweeting with it. But that being said, this is where it's terrifying, right? The fact that these accounts that you or I could have had and stopped using a couple years ago could be turned into automated bot accounts.
And yeah, to add on to that, we didn't even write a single line of code in order to automate. There's actually tools out there that allow you to automate these accounts really, really easily. So you don't even have to be like a crazy computer scientist or really like, you don't need to know a lot about computers in order to automate these accounts, which makes it even scarier.
So to me, I mean, like in some ways, this represents the same kind of attempts to use media to put forth propaganda that we've seen over the course of all sort of human and technological history. At the same time, especially with regard to the way that these messages can be amplified, it seems like we really are dealing with sort of a shift in how propaganda can work. Mm-hmm. What's your sense of how well this is understood? I mean, clearly you guys have thought deeply about it, but on a sort of society-wide level, and then certainly with the platforms that are hosts to this propaganda, like how much are we really grappling with the complexity of this problem?
Yeah, so when it comes to that issue, like I guess the approach that we've taken is twofold. So one, we want to empower users and give them the tools so that they can be informed when they're using Twitter or coming across these accounts. And that's where BotCheckMe comes in. And the second is to really put public pressure on these big companies. And so by giving users the tools, we've had users identify over almost 1 million suspicious accounts as of today. And as of 2 days ago, Twitter just announced that they were going to take a much more aggressive approach with how they were dealing bots. So the public pressure that we put on these big social media companies actually does make a difference. And that's sort of our answer to that.
And so well, two questions about that. One, you mentioned the having identified a million bots or suspected bots. Do you have a sense of how many of those have then been shut down, or like has Twitter actually dealt with them?
Yeah, we're actually noticing quite a few of those accounts actually get either suspended or terminated. Mm-hmm. So we are noticing that Twitter is taking action.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then to the next point of sort of like how people can make a difference and put pressure on these platforms to be accountable, what can be done at the individual level? Like in addition to like using tools to try to figure out where there's bot activity and flagging it, what are other ways that people should be thinking about how we should hold platforms accountable for their own products?
Yeah, so when it comes to like the consumption of content, one thing that we've really thought about is how do we build for critical thinking? How do we build products that effectively allow the user to do more than just consume the content that they're getting, but go further than that and say, hey, like, where does this content come from? Who's tweeting this out? Where am I reading this? And I guess like when it comes to how we sort of help that issue, we're really thinking through how we make that easier for users.
How do you guys think about, and I want to get in a moment to the next tool that you're working on as well, but how do you think about sort of, there's this tension that I see between, we're in this remarkable moment of the democratization of publishing, which is possible because of these amazing technologies where you can literally have a smartphone in your pocket and you know, fire off a tweet and be broadcasting to the world. I mean, this is still miraculous technology to me. At the other side of that, though, is that it creates all of this sort of like informational uncertainty and misinformation. And so how are you thinking about sort of the tension between those two things as you try to think of ways to help people kind of find good information?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the biggest things that technology's brought us is the fast access to information, and how basically even our attention spans have decreased because of that. We often look at headlines or just even look at the photos of these links instead of actually looking through the entire article. Oftentimes, my friends retweet out new pieces of information without actually reading the entire article and realizing it was a satire piece. And so this is like kind of the new world we live in. And in order to kind of prevent this, one is a mentality shift that we need to teach users, hey, we should be more wary of the information we share, the information we consume. And two is also making tools and providing that information so it's easy for users to come to that conclusion, provide users with that information all up front so they can come to their own conclusions and realize what's up with that information they're consuming.
And do you think that, this is a pretty cynical question, but do you think that the average consumer, the average Twitter user actually wants to do that work of verifying? Because it seems like if people aren't even clicking through to an article, how are we going to expect that they would like take an additional step to see if something's real?
Yeah, and you bring up exactly where our thinking comes in. Our whole philosophy is like, how do we build products that make that process just so easy that it doesn't require you to click? How do we present that information in a hover? How do we present that information without you even truly having to consume it first? We need to build products for this current generation and the way this current generation consumes information.
Well, and then how do you scale it too with so much information? I mean, newsrooms, even in a relatively large newsroom, it's an enormous effort to have to make sure that everything you're putting out is true. And so if you're sort of doing that from the reverse, like trying to build tools that analyze just like enormous amounts of information flowing through these platforms, it's hard for me to imagine how that scales. Does that? What do you guys think?
I mean, that's where the technology and like society, and that's where this becomes a very fundamentally like hard problem. And that's what me and Ash both really, really enjoy is like solving these like hard problems and making an impact. And that's where I think we bring up our new technologies and we bring up the expertise we have in machine learning and AI and social dynamics in order to present this information and make sure that these users are actually well informed of that information they see.
How good of a job do you think the platforms, I know you mentioned Twitter has been somewhat responsive to suspected bots, but how good of a job do you think they're doing in terms of like really grappling with the complexity of this problem and maybe even, I mean, I'd love to hear actually from you what you think their responsibilities are to this, to curb misinformation or propaganda on their platforms?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really tough problem. So like, they have some incredibly intelligent people at these big companies, and I'm sure that they're internally freaking out or like spending a lot of resources on trying to understand what the issue truly is at the bottom of it truly is. But that being said, in terms of what they can do, I guess this is very much a research problem, considering that it's a new phenomenon that's occurring. We see fake news as the next generation of spam. We've all seen spam in our inboxes, and we were able to essentially build for that.
And when you say fake news, I always sort of try to press people to define, you mean like propaganda or misinformation?
Right.
Okay. So back to sort of the platform's responsibility. You mentioned there are really smart people thinking about this and working on it, but I also see this tension in the fact that the very architecture of some of these platforms seems to incentivize really sort of appeals to emotion, rhetoric, like posting frequently, maybe not being fast at the expense of being accurate. So if these Twitter, I mean the Facebook like button, or the fact that people are fighting on, so how do we grapple with the fact that a lot of these platforms seem to be built to incentivize the opposite outcome of what you guys are going for? I mean, is that a fundamental problem?
Yeah, we definitely think it is a fundamental problem in the sense that the incentives are definitely misaligned, and I think that's sort of our thesis on what these big companies are thinking through, how in this new day and age we realign these incentives.
We're going to go to questions shortly. Did you want to add something on that?
Oh yeah, no, I was just saying that when Facebook and Twitter were built, I mean, they weren't probably thinking about this exact same phenomenon, how their tools would be gamified in the same way. Now with this insight that we have to re-engineer these kinds of tools in order to make sure that we are not misleading the public.
So we're going to go to questions in a moment. First, I wonder if you can talk a little bit about the next project that you're working on.
Yeah. So one of the interesting ideas, one of the greatest things about botcheck.me and how we launched it is we got a lot of different data. We got a lot of different data sources of fake news, how people interacted with it, and exactly how these propaganda bots were tweeting out. And so basically going back to like a research lab and basically looking at all this information we got, one of the craziest insights that we got was actually looking at the image on a specific news article. We actually ran a study on 13,000 different fake news articles, and found out that 70% of them.
Can I interrupt you again?
Yeah.
Give an example, because fake news is such an imprecise and dangerous term that so what's an example of what you mean when you say a fake news article? Like, what would that look like?
We're talking about intentionally misleading content. So like
So
there's
just fabricated by a state actor or something. Like,
it could be a state actor. It could be a group in Macedonia that's doing it for ad revenue. So like there are different actors that could be at play, but the core facet of fake news that we see is being intentionally misleading.
okay, so you're looking at the photos attached to these fabricated or misleading stories. Go ahead.
Yeah, definitely. And then by looking at these photos, we actually realized that many of them have been taken out of context or stolen from other sources. And you will often find that real journalism or truthful journalism, one that has gone through like fact-checking processes, have actual real photos that are generated for that specific story. But in the instance for these fake news articles, these photos and images are stolen from somewhere else. And also what makes fake news kind of cheap to produce, and it also is why it's not real journalism in some senses. And so if by actually taking a look at these images and building this graph and finding out where these images actually are, we can actually have a very high fidelity factor of understanding whether this image or whether this news article that we're sharing is actually a piece of fake news or intended to mislead users.
Were you able to like draw connections then between the entities that were using the same images, and potentially you could use that as a way to see what sorts of, how these networks are influencing one another?
Yeah, so effectively, like by using the image, you can tell that the New York Times is speaking about this image in this context, and fakenews.com is speaking about this image in this context, and they conflict. And so you can use that and realize that the internet talks about this is the general context for this image, and this is out of context.
And how would you handle, for example, like a wire photo? So like there are lots of stories, including on theatlantic.com, where you might find the same very newsworthy image used by the New York Times and the Atlantic, and lots of people using the same photo, but still legitimate journalistic enterprises.
Yeah. So this comes down to empowering the users with the indicators and the insights. And so we want to be able to say like, hey, this is where this photo has appeared, and these are all the different news sources that it's appeared upon, and these are the contexts that it's appeared in. And so you can come up with your own conclusion to whether this is fake news or not, or whether you're going to trust this or not.
So describe a little bit about how that would work from a user experience. So is it something like a browser extension, or just walk us through that a little bit if you would.
Yeah, so it's a browser extension where on Hover we tell you whether the content that you're reading is safe, unsafe, or has a warning associated to it. And on inspection, you can actually tell, we'll give you all the information that you need to essentially come to your conclusion on whether the information that you're reading is fake news, misinformation, or misleading content or not.
So
How do I buy this?
well, right. So and just to sort of correct me if I'm explaining this wrong, but basically a browser extension meaning something that you can add to your web browser so that when you're sort of mousing over a story, a little window would pop up and give you some key context that would help you understand what you're looking at.
That's correct, yeah.
Okay.
And what do you charge?
It's free.
How do you make money for all your work?
Yeah, so the way we think through this is fake news is a real issue where there's a real cost to brands and big organizations, and we'll provide this for free to the users of the internet, and we'll make money off of this by going to big companies and saying, hey, your brand is being hurt here, fake news is spreading about you here, and we can monitor all these threats.
So you're going to charge news organizations for being honest, is what you're telling me?
We're not going to charge news organizations anything. We're going to go to the big brands of the world and say, hey, like, your brand security is a big issue for you.
Okay, like Coca-Cola, you care about your reputation, let us help you, that kind of thing?
Yeah, and we can
Okay.
tell you exactly how you're portrayed on the internet.
Yeah, as a good example of this, during like April Fools, there was actually a big news story that went out, and it was basically saying how Microsoft was acquiring Spotify, and these two big tech companies are coming together in this big, huge acquisition. And it was actually released on April Fools as a complete joke. Like this wasn't actually happening, but more and more people kept on sharing it. That it wasn't only just on April Fool's Day. It ended up being viral on April 2nd, April 3rd, April 4th, and then as these people started seeing, oh, this news article on April 4th, they didn't realize the association that, hey, it was just associated with April Fools, and this is actually fake, this is just a joke. And we actually, looking into this article, we actually noticed that that same image was actually taken out of context at a different convention where Microsoft and Spotify were announcing basically a Spotify desktop version on Microsoft's platform. Not at all related to an acquisition, but basically just a new tool that was on the Microsoft platform.
That's a good question here.
That's a good example.
We have a mic if you need. I don't know. Sorry.
Why doesn't Twitter take this more seriously? They could mark that right away. They mark verified accounts. Why don't they mark untrustworthy accounts? Or do you think Twitter cares beyond being shamed or losing money?
Based on how their executives have responded, we believe that they do care. We also do believe that they should be doing more. But that being said, you bring up great points around like what they could be doing. We don't have that much transparency into what's in their product pipelines, but we do know this is a problem, and we do know we will build for it.
An unverified badge would make people so mad, but that's a great idea. I'm sorry. We'll go here and then, yeah.
Yeah, I wondered, in sort of looking into the network effects at play here, have you determined whether there are certain demographic groups or other kind of broad generalizations you can make as to who's particularly susceptible to bots and fake news?
We don't currently have data around that to share, unfortunately. Yeah.
It's a great question.
Or we haven't done analysis on that specifically, but yeah. So I can't, I don't really have specific data to share with you.
Do you have any guesses about it?
I don't want to like come to assumptions without looking at the data, yeah.
Someone over here. We have a microphone for you too, yeah, go ahead.
Will you have anything to stop all these people that call your cell phones? Oh, sorry. Because it's the most annoying thing in the world, and when I block it, they'll call again with a different number. And I'll, get fooled every time thinking it's an important business call.
That happens to me too, and I absolutely hate it.
It shows the evolution, though, of how these technologies are misused against people, I think. It's a similar kind of problem.
Along the same line, how can you prevent unwanted things, whether it's fake news, whether it's emails that you inherited $1.5 million in Nigeria, or whether it's someone trying to sell you real estate, but all the stuff that you really don't want, but it looks so real that you're tempted to take a look at it. And sometimes if it's an email, you can open a virus and mess yourself up.
Right.
There's a lot of people sort of my age in this room. What can you do to help? What can you advise us to do to help us get into trouble?
Yes, so the short answer would be to spend more time being meticulous about the information that you see, but we also realize that that isn't very practical, and that's why we're trying to build the tools so that we can bring the information to you really fast. And so that we give you indicators, and we give you the ability to inspect further if you really desire.
That's just on Twitter, right?
No, that we're building this for the entire internet. Mm-hmm. And so it would be on every site, every social media site, every news site.
So every URL that you will see, there will be an indicator associated with it as well.
We're going to go to more questions. I'm going to interrupt with one really quickly.
Yeah.
I do wonder how you think about sort of the tension between the ease of use, which we've talked about is so important to actually have people use these tools, versus making maybe sweeping judgments, or like, what if you get it wrong? I mean, the implications there are really big too. So how do you think about that?
Yeah, so on being wrong, the way we're approaching, so the new product is going to be called SurfSafe, and we're about to do a big launch for that in about a month. But that being said, the way we're approaching this is fake news is a very subjective term. Everyone has different definitions for what fake news is. And so the way we're approaching it is, hey, we want to give you like absolute truths. So for example, if an image is photoshopped, and photoshopped is when you put a face, for example, is when you put a face on another image, we'll tell you that and we'll give you the original. And we'll let you come to your own conclusion about whether that piece of information is your definition of fake news or not. But we don't want to be making that judgment whether something is fake news or not, but we want to very quickly give you the information so that you can come to that conclusion.
Yes, right here.
You guys talk about you or we. You talk about you or we. Is it just two people? You're the gatekeepers for the entire internet? And if that's the case, when you do a program like this, you're not able to sit at your computer and it's all going out because you're doing something else. It can't be a two-person operation, can it? And then if it is more than a two-person, that means everybody sitting down doing this for you is making very critical judgments of what should be considered fake and what should be considered true. How do you deal with that?
So again, on that question, we're not making the judgment whether something is fake or real. We're saying, hey, here's the information. It's been photoshopped. It's been out of context. It's been. We're going to give you very explicit indicators. It's up to you to come up to that decision.
And then a bit of context, actually, the first initial project we built, like botcheck.me, that was actually just built between Ash and I. We are the ones who built the entire thing, and that was just basically out of our college room, like apartment. And yeah, that was basically that. And then, so this new SurfSafe product that we're building, we're actually having some new engineers that we're hiring, and like helping us build that new product and helping us scale, especially as we launch in the next couple months or next month.
Right here, yes. Sorry. Give the mic.
Is image validation the only strategy that you use to determine if, is image validation the only strategy that you use to verify a tweet or a post, or do you have others?
Yeah, it's more than images. Images are like, let's call it the signature. It's how we get in, and then after we're in, we use textual analysis, and that comes in by like, you can take the image and look at the text that generally comes around the image, and then compare it to all the other instances of that same image, and look at the text that it comes along with that. So you can essentially do a text difference and see if the contexts are different or not.
And how do you weigh, in that case, the sort of sources? So I'm thinking about an example of like, what if several websites that are printing misinformation are all using the same Reuters photo and all using the same bad caption, but then the legitimate photo appears with the proper caption only in one place? Does the frequency of all of the same bad information like somehow skew your sense of what's actually right?
So with SurfSafe, we actually let users choose the sources that they trust. So let's say you trust the Washington Post. That'll be the source of truth for you.
But what if they choose a bad source?
So bad source, again, it's somewhat subjective from ours.
But there are facts in the world. Some things are true, some are not.
That is true, but the way we see it, let's say people choose something that's extremely on the right, like Breitbart, and they also choose Fox News. Sure, they might be both extreme right, but that being said, they're going to conflict with each other in a lot of different instances, and that's where we hope people start realizing that, hey, like, my news sources aren't of the same quality, and start moving closer to what is the objective truth.
And also, regardless, even no matter what news source you choose, you will still see the other instances where that same photo appears across the internet. And so you'll still be able to get all the different pieces of information. And you'll be able to see in one instance where a relatively high reputable news source or a news source a lot of people visit will be having a different photo and a different context around that.
What sources do you guys read most? What's your news habit like? Not to put you on the spot, but
Yeah.
other than the Atlantic, of course.
So the Atlantic, I try to. So with me, I try to be pretty diverse in terms of the content that I consume. Especially being so close to this issue, I realize how like sticking to a single news source can sometimes sort of bias your point of view, and that's something that I'm very aware of. And so I try to make my news consumption fairly diverse.
Yeah, and exactly. This is exactly kind of how we found out the inspiration behind this. So whenever there's a news source, like for example, that Spotify Microsoft news source, one of the first things I did is I had to Google search it and make sure other news sources were talking about this, and this is something that was happening. And when I did this Google search, I found out no other articles were talking about it, just that one article. And I started questioning. I was like, wait, this probably doesn't look right.
Right.
There's probably something wrong here. And then I looked at more of the comments, looked at more of the context around it, and I realized that, hey, this was published on April 1st, and this was obviously probably a joke. And so with that extra context, you're looking around and looking at those news sources, you can understand what's real and what's kind of fake.
Other questions? Yeah, and we'll have a microphone come to you.
Just the fact that you said you had to Google search, doesn't that raise a question in itself that there's not another option?
Like another search engine, you mean?
Right.
I mean, so one of the interesting things we want to build with SurfSafe is the ability to see where exactly this image or this context is being spread around. And so that doesn't necessarily use Google, but it uses basically wherever a user sees or wherever a person sees this piece of information, this piece of context, we'll be able to know that this image matches this other image in this other context, and we'll be able to present that information to you. And so we want to be able to do that essential Google search for you, but give you all the information up front over that hover, over that click. So you have all the information up front.
You raise a really good point, though, I think. I'm not sure if this is what you intended, but the fact that, that a company like Google has such an outsized influence on our collective ability to surface information, and crucially in moments where we're trying to figure out what's actually real. And I think that...
Distilling information for us, choosing
Right.
among sources.
Right, exactly. I'm with you. Who else has a question? Over here, yes.
Yeah, Dan Morrison from the Pew Research Center. Thanks for the shout out.
Sure, you got it.
Yeah, I've heard you talk about companies and how your tool may be useful for companies. I'm curious if it may also be useful at the government level. The reason I ask that is because we also did a study fairly recently on the net neutrality public comment moment at the FCC. So there were 21 million submissions, and we were able to determine that only 6% of those were unique. So the other 94% were multiple submissions. We were also able to determine that 58% were either duplicate emails or temporary emails that could be quickly jettisoned after a campaign, for example.
Right.
I'm curious if you're thinking that way as well, how could governments use a tool like this to be helpful in a highly democratic process of public comments in a highly important issue such as net neutrality?
So I guess like one thing that might be, we haven't really thought through a government approach. The way we've sort of thought through this is like building something that could be used by the consumers and then the private sector. But that being said, we do think there are a lot of different applications around government. So for example, like around counterterrorism, we'd be able to sort of monitor how like photos around terrorism or photos that are used to recruit terrorists are spreading. We do believe that there are massive applications around government, but that's just not something we've thought through as of yet.
Over here, yeah.
So you guys have identified all these commonalities with the fake news sources. I'm curious, like you're sharing, essentially your algorithm with us. Are you concerned that these fake news creators will, understand what your algorithm is and adapt?
Yeah, so the way we think through this, and great question. The way we think through this is the problem with fake news is, or the way we're approaching fake news or misinformation or misrepresented content is we want to make it incredibly expensive for these creators to create this content. And so that means making it impossible for them to steal images. That means making it very, very easy for anyone to fact check what they're reading. And so, going back to that point, yes, like our algorithms are also going to be fairly public. We want to make sure that the public understands how we're actually approaching giving them this information, considering that was an issue with a lot of these big social media companies. But that being said, hopefully that gives you a little bit of our philosophy around how we're sort of tackling this problem.
Other questions?
Is there any legal ramifications for somebody who has a photo that's reprinted or taken away? Who the original source, how can they legally fight the fact that somebody else is sharing their image?
I can speak to this a little bit. I mean, there are copyright protections that people, I don't think it's necessarily an easy process, particularly when images are really widely spread, to go after every single misuse. But in the United States, at least, there is a copyright protection that people could attempt to leverage to protect their photos.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and in addition to that, I think there are a couple of services that try to do that. It is like a long, laborious process, so it does take months or anything for any action to happen. And so that's kind of the unfortunate part of that instance. But in the instance where like a photo is being stolen and you can be able to tell that this is something else, then that would be really useful.
Yeah.
Right up front, yes. We have a mic coming to you.
Is it possible, or how difficult is it to identify the source of the bot? Who's responsible for putting it out there? And would you be able to identify whoever's responsible in this service that you're putting together?
Yeah, so in terms of identifying that's data that Twitter probably has, but doesn't make public for probably privacy reasons, just because like data around like where these accounts are coming from would be incredibly helpful around identifying like these state actors, but really harmful for the end user who would have their personal information out there. But that being said, the way we've sort of approached grouping information at scale together is looking at trends. So one thing that we publish on botcheck.me every 15 minutes is the topics that are trending on by bots and in misinformation. So whether it's certain hashtags that are like violent or divisive, we actually track all of that.
And this is this is actually a really helpful tool. I can say even as a journalist, I've looked at this often. Like when you're seeing a really charged political debate play out on Twitter and you know there are two hashtags that either the Democrats or Republicans are pushing forth, and you then look and find that in fact there is, not that there aren't humans really engaged with this hashtag, but also that there are bots sort of latching onto it and perhaps hijacking it and then steering the debate in ways that may distort your impression of sort of how important it is to either side. I've thought about this journalistically and how I think about how we cover stories. So I think that's a really important tool. Other questions? Yes, right here.
So thank you very much for the public service that you guys are performing by doing this, and I hope it's a successful venture for you as well. Are the techniques that you're using only detecting sort of the simplest forms of bots, not ones that maybe vary their content semantically, be using AI techniques or something like that? Or, which ones are you catching? And you've talked about sort of trying to apply this to everything on the internet, but do the same techniques really apply to other social media platforms that have different content length, different characters, different languages, et cetera, et cetera? Vkontakte or Klube or something. Is it going to work for those social media platforms as well?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's actually a request that we've gotten a lot. Is beyond Twitter, how can we fight bots on other social media platforms, from like Reddit to Facebook and other places? And it's a really good question. We basically started with Twitter first because we saw it as the biggest public social media platform. Anyone can post on this platform, and they would spread to anyone else on the internet, regardless of whether or not you really follow them, just because it went viral. And that doesn't happen normally as much as on the other social media platforms. And so we saw Reddit as this big battleground for us to first partake in. And yes, this is true. There's other bot problems elsewhere. And that's something that we ultimately like to look forward to and try to accomplish, especially as we expand out. Because even when we were building botcheck.me, it took a few months of just researching the entire problem, just us spending nearly full time just researching the entire problem to understand and build this algorithm. And ideally, we'd love to do the same thing for other social media platforms as well, and especially for international politics.
And do you see, this is sort of adding to your question, do you see bot behavior evolving? I know you talked about some of the factors that make it clear that something is likely a bot, but how is that changing over time?
Yeah. So we've actually saw initial bots, and this is back in 2012, back in 2011. There was actually some articles on detecting bots back then. And then it was really simple. All you just had to do was just check to see if that bot was tweeting the whole 24 hours in a day. And that was the extent of bot accounts. Now it's gotten a lot more complicated, right? There's a lot more factors in these accounts. So it's almost like a game of war. The offense gets better, then the defense gets better, then the offense gets better, and the defense gets better. Ultimately, what we'd like to do is get the defense so good that it becomes very, very expensive and not really worth for the offense to keep on doing this. And it no longer becomes financially, they no longer get the same kind of ad revenue, they no longer get the same kind of social reception with these kinds of techniques. And ultimately, if we can build our defense up to that kind of wall, then we can mitigate a lot of these effects.
And on top of that, because of all the users that we have using our service, we actually learn with time. And so as the bots have gotten more and more complicated, more and more diverse in terms of the tactics that they use, our users have actually been able to gather so much data around what these bots look like, and it really helped us actually build out these models to keep tracking these bots.
We have time for a couple more questions.
Chinese?
Go ahead.
Who speaks Chinese among you? And how do you deal with other languages? We're all thinking English. Don't you have to be able to talk other languages to find out if fake news is there?
Yeah, so specific to Twitter and botcheck, we were focused on American propaganda in the American network. But that being said, the way we look at this, machine learning isn't actually language specific. It's able to essentially whittle out like these statistical models that it's essentially able to look at language relationally as opposed to looking at it as the same way we do.
So like looking for patterns rather than the actual message. So
Right.
the frequency of the tweeting, whether there's the use of various hashtags. Is that right?
Yeah, that's correct.
And it can also detect like bias and polarization in some senses as well. So especially if have some of the resources, we'd like to build these models out for all kinds of languages and for different kinds of politics across the world. And that'd be something we'd like to essentially grow ourselves up to.
Over here, yes.
So what I'm thinking about is that you've talked about the costs are that the companies are having to pay ad revenue, but then the other cost is that there's misinformation that's causing polarization. Is there not some impetus for the companies, if they're paying out ad revenue, for them to become more active in terms of how these things are affecting them economically?
Yeah, it's been pretty fascinating. Like companies are starting to take a major role around like fake news and sort of forcing these ad networks to take a much stronger stance in terms of looking for fake news. So, for example, I think it was P&G that pulled out. I hope I'm not misremembering it, but I think they pulled out $300 million from YouTube ad spend because of their ads running against fake news and terrorist videos. And so there are steps that companies can take, considering that ad revenue does play a big role in the incentivizations for these actors.
And I mean, my sense is that we've seen platforms only just begin to grapple with some of this, largely because of reports about propaganda being used to sway the 2016 election. So I think that was sort of a turning point for some of these platforms in terms of we really do need to at least grapple with this. But I am not quite as sunny as you are about how seriously they're taking them. I agree there are very smart people working at these companies, but I think that the evidence that they're really taking action to change things is fairly limited at this point. Other questions? Yes, back here.
So what general advice would you give to a young entrepreneur trying to build a successful tech startup?
Find a problem that really bothers you. At the end of the day, building a tech company is it's a considerable amount of work. Where at sometimes you'd probably be better off emotionally and in many ways financially working a normal job. So from that perspective, it really does become a labor of love. So from that perspective, find a problem that really aggravates you and work on that.
Yeah, and to add on to that, the botcheck.me stuff that Ash and I have been working on, that's something that we just decided to do as a project along with, partly with our college stuff, and then eventually we dropped out. But we were just working along with that stuff just because we were passionate about it. We had no intention of even monetizing it. We were giving it out to the users for free. We were actually incurring all those server costs ourselves. But it's such a problem that we really thought was really important. And because of that, we got so much data, and we're understanding better basically looking at this propaganda market a little bit better and in more light, and we can come back to it again with a stage 2, a better process, a better iteration.
Where do you get all the data you analyze? Is it, when you're talking about your analyzing data, you're just a ton of tweets, is that right? How do you just...
So Twitter has a public API. They limit the amount of times you can pull from it.
Right.
So essentially we created a server that would pull data, it would get blocked by Twitter, and then it would wait.
Oh, okay,
And then it would pull data, and then over time you gather enough data to actually make these machine learning models.
Good. Yes, right back here.
Who are your competitors in the marketplace? That's okay. Did you hear that?
Yeah, you asked who our competitors were?
Who are your competitors in the marketplace, and what would you describe as your position in the market?
Yeah, so with the fake news market, even calling it that feels kind of weird in the sense that it's a very new space. Most people haven't really realized how to monetize it, and most people don't think it's monetizable. And so from that perspective, we actually hope that there are more competitors in the sense that this is a real problem that we both hope gets solved in the next 10 years. And so from that perspective, we don't really have too many competitors right now, and we hope that does change.
Do you think it really will get solved in the next 10 years?
I think we will build the tools to make it so that we're able to consume the information that we're consuming today in a more safe manner.
There's another question back here, yes.
Hi. So has Twitter approached you and said, join forces with us?
So on Twitter, so funny story. So we've talked to.
This is why they're so nice about Twitter. We're about to find out, right? No, I'm kidding.
We should be a little bit more mean. Just kidding. So Twitter actually hasn't. We've had no formal conversations with Twitter at all. We've talked to most of the other major social media companies, but not a tweet from Twitter.
Have you tried?
We have tried. We've been covered by a lot of different news organizations. They've all reached out on our behalf. And then on top of that, we've sent out personal emails to like Jack Dorsey, people within the company as well. We've talked to numerous people outside of Twitter who used to be pretty high-profile individuals within the company. But that being said, in terms of people in the company right now, we haven't heard a single tweet.
Why don't you think they want to talk to you?
We aren't entirely sure. It might be that the way that the story is spun every time a news organization writes about us, the story always goes, the two college kids doing what Twitter won't. and so like...
That was our initial
They don't
article,
like talking to
yeah.
reporters either. It's okay. You're not alone. Any other questions? We have about 3 minutes remaining. Yes, right here.
Okay. So y'all have not graduated from college?
To our parents' disappointment, utter disappointment, we have not.
Yes, this is true.
We love Berkeley, though. We're very active in the community.
And Berkeley's been super supportive about it, and we've been talking to professors there as well.
We'll take this and then one more question, and then we'll.
I'm just curious about the product offering for brands around brand safety. How you guys are thinking about that?
Yeah, so this is like further up our timeline, and we haven't actually even publicly talked about it, but I'll drop the name. We're working on a product called Content Safe, where essentially brands can give us their brand name, they can give us brand images, they can give us assets that are associated to their brand, and we can give you how your brand is being presented all across the internet. So let's say you are let's say you're Coca-Cola. We can tell you exactly how people on the internet are actually talking about you and how your images are actually being presented.
Or like if people are like using your logo in a meme or something, would that be interesting?
We can show you memes. We can show you all the different contexts that your logo or your content appears in.
All right.
Yeah.
Last question, right over here.
What would the difference in sophistication of something like that be compared with like Google Alerts or Mention or services like that?
Yeah. So Google can do the internet that they can scrape. For us, we can see the entire internet across across social media sites and like areas that Google just can't get into.
Like, what's an example of that?
So for example, memes on Facebook, we'd be able to understand like exactly how on social media, which tends to be a good portion of where this content is actually appearing, how your brand is actually appearing there.
And also, we would also be able to get some very interesting trends. So we'd be able to see where this image appears first, then where it appears next, and then where it appears elsewhere. And then you can actually build a pretty cool virality graph of where this image is spread and across what users and what social groups.
All right. Thank you both so much. This is fascinating and best of luck. Thank you, everyone, for being here.
Thank you so much for having us.